I do think we are at an inflection point for brain-computer interfaces, what I would call a Kitty Hawk moment. And I think just as we saw after the Wright brothers sent that plane into the air, we're going to see an explosion of advanced development of these technologies.
Over the past few years, the prospect of linking our brains directly with computers has given rise to the beginnings of a new industry. Dozens of startups are popping up, creating products to help people with mental and physical disabilities, revolutionize the way we interact with technology, and even alter the functioning of our own brains.
We essentially open the door to the access of our minds by technology. So we're talking about the changing of foundations of what it means to be human.
How did we get here? How well does all this stuff actually work? And if this technology lives up to its transformational potential, are we ready for it?
So a brain-computer interface is a device that interfaces the brain with the outside world. It could be a computer, it could be a machine. And these brain-computer interfaces, or BCIs, could be inserted inside the brain. So those are invasive BCIs. Or they could be wearables that you would wear on top of your head. BCIs can record the activity of the brain, the firing of individual neurons. Obviously, if you take information out of the brain, you can in principle decode what that means. No? And just like there was a transition in technology from the PC to the smartphones, it is possible, I would say likely, that the next transition will be from a device that you have in your pocket to a device that you have in your head.
If you've heard of one brain-computer interface, it's probably this one.
All right, welcome to the Neuralink product demo. I'm really excited to show you what we've got. I think it's going to blow your mind.
When Elon speaks, we all listen. That's just life in the 21st century. But Neuralink and its competitors didn't come out of nowhere. They're built on decades of work by neuroscientists attempting to understand and interpret what's going on in the brain. One of those neuroscientists, and a key player in the development of BCIs, is this guy, Dr. Lee Hochberg.
I'm the director of the BrainGate pilot clinical trials. The BrainGate pilot clinical trials are seeking to determine the safety and feasibility of allowing somebody with paralysis to control an external device simply by thinking. The origins of this field can be traced easily back to the late 1950s and early 1960s.
Dr. Robert Heath has implanted electrodes, which cause no pain, in the brains of these monkeys.
Researchers were placing single electrodes into the brain of animals in a research laboratory, asking the fairly straightforward question of how does that neuron in that part of the brain relate to the control of voluntary movement? And then in the late 1990s, here at Brown University, John Donahue, professor of neuroscience, did an experiment in the research laboratory, which was to ask a non-human primate to play a video game. And the researchers begin to build a map between the brain activity and the movement of the hand. After building that map, that program would be able to predict where the animal's hand actually was in space. It could then play a small trick on the animal, which is to disconnect the joystick. And at that moment, the joystick is no longer controlling the cursor on the screen. The neural activity itself is controlling the cursor movement. So we begin to describe that as a cursor that's moving under neural power alone. And that was really a breakthrough moment.
Within a few years, researchers were trying out the same thing in humans.
So in the spring of 2004, the BrainGate clinical trials were launched. The technology begins with a sensor, or an array as we call it, that's placed in the brain. The sensor itself is about 4 by 4 millimeters, the size of a baby aspirin. And when tapped into the top of the brain, it has the ability to record from individual neurons. So that when somebody thinks about moving their own hand, we can allow them to control a cursor on a computer screen or some other assistive technology.
What do you want to do first?
I'd like to draw a circle.
You're gonna draw a circle. Excellent.
That incredible first participant was able to think about opening and closing a prosthetic hand. And which was, I think he said out loud what everybody else was thinking.
Not bad, man, not bad at all.
The third participant was an extraordinary woman who had had a stroke in the brainstem. She could feel everything, she could hear everything, but she couldn't move and she couldn't speak. And she said she wanted to take a drink. So we brought in a robotic arm. She was thinking about reaching and grasping that thermos of coffee. As she did that, the robot arm moved out, grabbed that thermos of coffee, and then she took a sip of cinnamon latte. And it was the first time in nearly 15 years that she was able to do so solely of her own volition.
Over the 17 years of the BrainGate trials, the technology has come a long way, particularly as advances in machine learning have made strides helping to decode data recorded from the brain. Recently, they were even able to have a paralyzed man imagine the motion of handwriting and translate that into text on a screen with 94% accuracy. But clinical trials in university labs, they're really just a first step.
At some point, there needs to be an off-ramp to a company who's then going to focus on developing what, as an academic, a word that I don't use that often, to make a product. It needs to be submitted for regulatory approval, and then it needs to be marketed and supported and made available.
When we first started this company, people almost kind of took this as just kind of almost crazy science fiction. And I think we're getting past the believability factor. We're starting to see what was originally kind of research technology take flight in the clinical domain. And I think we're going to see many, many more of these type of technologies.
Here in St. Louis, a company called Neurolutions recently got one of the first FDA approvals ever for a BCI. In this case, a non-invasive EEG headset that reads the electrical activity of the brain. The measurements aren't as precise as with an invasive system like the one BrainGate uses, but they work for Neurolutions' purpose, helping stroke victims to reconnect their mind with a paralyzed limb.
All right, so we're just going to test the headset real quick. All connections good, nice and relaxed.
My name's Mark Forrest. I live in St. Louis all my life, and turned out I had a stroke. And I was pretty much paralyzed on my right side. A lot of people told me after 6 months that I was pretty much done and I was going to have hardly any movement.
When somebody has a stroke, a part of their brain dies. For instance, the right side is injured, and the left side can't move. Now, but if you talk to these patients, they can imagine moving, they can try to move, they just can't actually execute that movement.
We know that 90% of those motor fibers that control opening and closing that hand are on that side where the injury occurred. What we found is that there's actually 10% on the healthy side, on the other side of the brain, that controls thought of, I want to move my hand.
And so what we did is we created a brain-computer interface that really has 3 parts to it. A wearable headset, a robotic exoskeleton, and a tablet that walks them through how to use the system.
All right, let's see. So let's do 30 seconds rest, and then I'm going to hit next, and we'll see what control you'll get.
At the beginning of the program, it tells you not to move your hand, but think about moving your hand. And that's what you have to do.
And then just imagine.
It's picking up that intention to move on the uninjured side of the brain. It's converting that intention to a movement of the exoskeleton. As the person continues to use it over time, it's essentially leading to a rewiring of the brain. There's this kind of neuroscience notion of what fires together, wires together. So when they're generating those brain signals to move and they're getting that feedback from that wearable, that's leading to new connections forming in the brain that allows eventually that uninjured side of the brain to take over control of the paralyzed limb.
My movement was just this. That's all I could do. Look how much difference I've made, progressed, using that machine. I have arm movement, I have finger movement, I have wrist movement. It got me motivated to where I actually built my own fishing boat. My oldest son said it's going to sink, it's not going to float. My best friend told me it was going to sink and not going to float. Well, I proved them all wrong. Laura works in mysterious ways. Shit happens and nothing new about it. So you just make it work.